We are going to finish up our Genesis cycle with the story of Joseph in chapter 45 and the accompanying Psalm 133, and then Romans 11, and just a few verses of that, and then a real cryptic saying out of Matthew 15. So, the last time we were in Genesis, we read the story of Joseph's brothers being jealous of him. They end up finding a way to get rid of him. There was a plot to kill him, then there was a plot to sell him, and we don't know exactly how that all went down, but the result was that Joseph got taken off to Egypt. He was gone, okay? And as far as the brothers were concerned, they thought he was dead. And in the meantime, okay, so what's happening back at the farm? There's a famine in the land of Israel. And when there's a famine in Israel, the movement has always been go to Egypt, okay? Egypt seems to be that lifeline for food in those kinds of times, and this one was no different. Well, in the meantime, while that famine was going on, Joseph had risen to prominence in Egypt, right? The Pharaoh had made him prince, as one of the words is used for him, of Egypt, and almost like a minister of agriculture, secretary of the interior, some type of high authority kind of person, right? Well, in Genesis chapter 45, there's going to be a finally thunk, a thud. Spoiler: there's going to be a meeting. Okay, the brothers are going to meet up with this Joseph, but not before Joseph. In several chapters, remember, these people are coming from Israel, and they actually end up coming before Joseph, and they don't know who Joseph is. Joseph knows who they are, but they don't know who Joseph is, and Joseph is kind of toys with them in several visits, trying to get them to bring, so he can see his younger brother Benjamin and his father, and there's all kinds of machinations that are going on. But then the coup de grace, the big climax of all of that, happens in chapter 45, which is what we have for today, verses 1 through 15, where it says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out." Now you got a picture in the room, he's got attendants, Egyptian attendants, right? And his as well as his brothers that are there. His brothers don't know who he is, but yet Joseph does know who they are, and they've come, wanting something from him. And he cried out, "Send everyone away from me!" So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. So the narrator is already here giving us a little spoiler saying what's about to happen, right? "And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it." This is kind of like before anything happens, he has an emotional release. There has been no identity revelation yet, but he's already emoting over it, right? Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." Remember, they thought that he was dead, okay? And so, and for him to say this to his brothers, who, if Joseph were alive, first of all, if they had any thought that Joseph was alive, they would be fearing what Joseph would do to them, let alone what Joseph could do to them if Joseph was actually, or had actually risen to a point of power, right? That's what's amazing about it. It's like, oh, wow. They never even dreamed that he would be in a position of authority, let alone alive, okay? Yeah. And so he says, I am Joseph. And then his first thing he says is my father still alive? Yeah. This question bespeaks, really how in the dark Joseph was, and the hope that he can restore, his old father with, some hope and some joy. But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Yeah, they were dismayed because this is a shocker, okay? It's like in one of those mystery movies where somebody that, I've been watching reruns of Columbo lately, right? Well, it's like, what would happen if somebody kills, somebody's killed, and then they stash the body somewhere, and they figure out where to put the body. They go back to where the body is, and the body was gone. That's so dismayed were they at his presence. Okay, that's a similar motif or a similar anxiety level, right? Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Self-identification, it's like, that Joseph, yeah, not the other Joseph, yeah. The mentioning of this is his way of saying, and is getting to what he is going to actually blatantly say, which is, you took action that set my life on a certain trajectory. And I know you had no clue, but this is it. This is that trajectory. Yeah. Whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Yeah. The intention of death, okay? The human machinations of what we think needs to happen in order for us to get what we want, totally gets exploded here, right? You sold me here for God. Don't be upset for that dastardly deed. This is the ultimate of way forgiveness should look. And notice he doesn't even say, "I'm still a little bit miffed about all this." He doesn't even say that. Don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Big picture. Notice big picture. He doesn't focus on any little peccadillos, little like that thing you're holding on to of like, I just want revenge after this thing. No, nothing of the like, right? For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. Remember, the famine threatened the continuation of the promise that was made to Abraham, to Isaac, ultimately to Jacob, with regard to being multitudinous in the way of the sands of the sea, that kind of a thing, right? So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Yeah. Joseph has the wisdom in all of this to see that the God's hand it's much more important to see what God's hand is in all of this than to think about, what do I need now to become a more adjusted human being? What kind of closure do I need on, he doesn't ask those questions. I think that all of that does get healed. All of those hurts do get healed for him in his theological understanding of how it was that God was at work and what God was doing through him, especially in the sense of redemption, salvation, and all of that. That seemed to be the balm that and the salve that was needed for this sore, of this bad thing that happened in his life. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh. Okay, yeah, but God. So what we get here is a picture of how God's sovereignty is even at work in our random choices. This isn't about predestination. This isn't about arguing one way or the other about human will. But it does suggest that God has a way. It's a mysterious way, but it's a way of working through our human decisions. Even when they're bad ones, God has a way of working through them and bringing something not just good out of it, but magnificent and glorious and wondrous, and with much larger implications than you can even imagine. This is similar to what we see in the New Testament with the cross, right? Yeah. So the Pharaoh, father of Pharaoh, this just explains, it tells us, the stature that Joseph held here in Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. His first request is he wants his father to see him. You shall settle in the land of Goshen. Goshen is a portion of that land of Egypt in the Delta region, which is, by the way, where we find them when the book of Exodus opens up, right? You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. This sounds like blessing, okay? But when the story of Genesis, the book of Genesis closes, and then Exodus begins, there's this seemingly like, oh, isn't this wonderful? You'll have a place to live and a place to eat and a place to thrive, and they end up being slaves, essentially. Verse 11, I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come. Yeah, this is speaking of what's happening already in Israel, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. Yeah. Amazing how our plans for what prosperity looks like and how God helps us achieve it are 2 different things, isn't it? And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. Okay, Benjamin, this was his, remember, Joseph was the second to youngest brother. The very youngest was Benjamin. These were the only 2 offspring from the womb of Rachel, the preferred wife of Jacob, right? So they had a special bond. because they were the only one. They had the same mother and father in common. All the other sons, the other 10 sons, there were 3 mothers that bore the other 10 sons. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Yeah, that's because he's concerned about the fact that it's journeying back and forth. It was a lot of work, and the elderly did not do that, and he knew that his dad had to be in that state, right? And so that's why he's saying, hurry, because I want to make sure before he's dead, you know. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. Benjamin was with the brothers. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. This is a great scene of reunion in the Bible, a great scene of redemption, a great scene of forgiveness, a great scene that illustrates the purposes of a sovereign God as the Lord of history, even through the bad things that we do as human beings. Even when we do bad things, God can make something good out of it. All right, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try not to make bad choices. It just means that God has a way. God is so powerful that God can actually work with our bad decisions. Yeah, and it's just up to us. Are we willing to let God, to see God in it? And that's what our friend Joseph here was able to see. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. Psalm 133. Psalm 133, as the Psalms are, they tend to be a response to an attitude or a conviction or an idealized way of being for a character in our first lesson story. Oh, how good and pleasant it is when brethren live together in unity. Yeah, we can get that, right? Because it's like, we had this reunion story of all the brothers and of Jacob, the sons of Jacob. And so, yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I get it. How pleasant it is when brethren live together in unity. It is like fine oil upon the head that runs down upon the beard. This is a song of ascents, okay? There's only, 5 verses in this psalm. And we're getting the whole psalm here. But it's a psalm of ascents. It's one where it's something that the people would, at the coronation of a king or the anointing of a king, or a new king is like taking the throne, that kind of used liturgically in that kind of setting, okay? It is like fine oil upon the head that runs down upon the beard of Aaron, and runs down the collar of his robe. This was an action that happened in the anointings, where the oil would drip, and you wouldn't just use a little bit of it either. They would have let it just, yeah. And if you're gonna, and that's the description of how good and pleasant it is when brethren live together. Fine oil upon the head, running down upon the beard. Upon the beard, it runs down. It's like it's plenty. It's like it's so good and moist, and it brings life, and it's so costly. And that's the idea here. And then they use another metaphor, a simile. Okay. It is like the dew of Hermon. That was a mountain to the north. The dew, Mount Hermon was that's where the melt off. The dew also, the dew, whatever, and the snow melt that fed the Jordan River, okay? That falls upon the hills of Zion. For there the Lord has ordained the blessing, life forevermore. Yeah. Okay, so this is what we see in the psalm. It's very brief, but it's something that has a correlation to how wonderful it is, a celebration of reconciliation, of reunion, of love. Yeah. When it didn't look like love was possible. Okay, Romans. Okay, we've been in Romans a few weeks. We're going to be in Romans for a couple more months, actually. Well, not, I think the middle of September or somewhere. We're still in Romans. But yeah, Romans 11. Romans 11. Remember, one of the things, Romans gives us a more systematic theology of Paul than we get anywhere else, although it's still somewhat of an occasional letter in that he is speaking to a congregation where they've been dealing with ostracizing. Certain segments of the community had, like the Jews got kicked out by the Romans, and then the Romans allowed them back in, and that caused some disruptions in the church, because the church was a conflagration of Gentiles and Jewish people. And so, and Paul, who talks, he wants to put together a theology whereby it makes it possible for everybody to see that they're in it together. And so he has to argue a lot of times, like, so what about the Jews? So if the Jews are so much God's chosen people, but yet this thing that God did through Christ is the defining thing, what about that? What's the deal? And so that's kind of like the context for a lot of what he says. Now, chapter 11, verses 1 to 2a, and then this skips down to verses 29 to 32. So we don't get a whole lot of verses. Listen. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Is it fortuitous that we had the Benjamin mentioned in our first lesson? God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Yeah, even though Paul is sold out on the messianic nature of who Christ is and how Christ represents the future, and Christ represents that thing through which God chose to continue what God started with Israel. He wants to make sure people don't think he's saying that, oh, God has no use now for that. No, he's not saying that. Now, well, you're going to see that revisited a little bit in our gospel. But let us skip down to verse 29. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Yeah. What God expects of Jews is what God expects of Gentiles, and what God expects of everybody. That God is God. God has one. That's God's way. Okay. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. So here, he's talking about the Gentiles and the Jews in the congregation, right? Just as you were once disobedient, he's talking about to you Gentiles, okay? But have now received mercy because of their disobedience. Their disobedience being how the Jews actually treated Jesus, right? So they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. So it's like in the mercy God shows to the Gentiles through. It's like there is this. Same motif, I hope you get this, that we had back in the Joseph story, where the machinations, the decisions, the bad choices, the wrong-headed ideas that motivate the actions of humans, even though they are bad and stupid and wrong, God somehow works through it. This is, I believe, the nature of what Paul is saying as well. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful to all. Paul is trying to put everything together. He's trying to melt everything together so that we see, so that there's no longer any false dichotomy, false decision to see us as separate. The ethnicities, he's like, the ethnicity is nothing anymore. But yet in our day and age, ethnicity has become huge. It's huge. People are like, oh yeah, we got to pay attention to you. Paul is striving to melt that down so that there is no distinction in that realm anymore. And yet we tend to try and keep that alive, like that matters. It certainly doesn't matter to God. Okay. Now, that's it for Romans, okay? Just a very short thing, and I didn't realize when I was studying this how it kind of jibes with the kind of thing we saw in the Joseph story. But Matthew 15, we have a parenthetical verses 10 to 20, and then verses 21 to 28. 21 to 28 is the portion that you have to do, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. And 10 to 20 is the optional. But I'm going to read the whole thing as is my nature. Okay. Then he called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand." We've had a lot of parables of Jesus. The last thing that we had happen was, after a feeding, he ends up doing a teaching on the water. Remember the Peter and he's falling through the water and all of that. Well, here's another teaching piece. Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. This goes back to the Jewish laws, which were seen as divinely given with regard to food intake and what was proper and what was improper. And that seems that what we get in Matthew and the Gospels in general with Jesus is that's something on my screen. What we get with Jesus is his saying, that was then and this is now. That's really nothing we have to pay attention to anymore. We don't need to emphasize our distinctiveness through our diet anymore. Life goes on. Listen and understand. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. Then I can think of so many. That is so in line with the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, and when they would confront the kings with regard to. And the priests, when the prophets would confront the priests, which is like, yeah, you're so concerned about doing things right that you don't realize that you're being wrong in the attitudes that you espouse, even though you feel so good about dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Then the disciples approached and said to him, "Do you know do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" And he answered, "Well, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted." Which is a way of saying, if God isn't in it, it's not going to last. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind leading the blind, right? One of the things that was going on in the early church in Matthew was some clashes with the synagogue, and the Pharisees were the keepers of the synagogue. And so that's the reason why we find in the gospel stories, especially Matthew, this clash between him and the Pharisees, because there was a problem with that, with regard to the Pharisees' view toward those who saw Jesus as the Messiah, the Christians, right? Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said to him, explain this parable to us. And then he said, are you also still without understanding? Remember, we'd had a whole lot of parables, this is... and I've talked extensively about, whether or not the parables were something that Jesus actually interpreted, or if that came later. There's different ways of seeing that. So then he said, are you still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? Kind of a graphic way of seeing the GI tract, right? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. The attitudes and the emotions and sometimes we hide that in our politics, folks. Especially we'll take up a certain political identity because, if I take on this political identity, then that gives me an excuse to not be compassionate toward XYZ. It happens. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. All right. So this is a big strike on the authority of the Torah and the seemingly validity of the law of Moses going forward. Now, we're going to get a scene. This next scene gives us a little bit of a different picture of that and a different take on it. Listen. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon, not heavily Jewish towns, okay? Just then, a Canaanite woman came from that region, came out and started shouting. Canaanite woman is a very interesting designation because it's kind of like referring to somebody in the United States as Navajo or one of the native tribes that were here first, because usually they got that's such an ancient identification. It's really odd, but it's a reminder of the thing that Israel contended with when it entered the land of promise, and that was the inhabitants of the land already, and what they did or didn't do with them, yada yada. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." Okay, right there, where it says she's a Canaanite woman, but then this comes out of her mouth, recognizing her as who he is, from the line of Israel, through the monarchy of David. It's like, oh, that's actually a confession of faith. Yeah, that is actually a confession of faith, and it is a confession of faith on who Jesus is, the real identity of Jesus, coming out of the mouth of somebody who was not in Jesus, the religion of Jesus, the religion that raised Jesus, the religion that Jesus grew out of, okay? My daughter is tormented by a demon. Okay, so she's coming to him with a request, and she does a good job of confessing. Like, she knows who he is. She knows what he has the power to do. She recognizes what we have in this woman is a recognition of what of the forward position of what the church will eventually be, which is open for everyone, right? This is a reality that Matthew's church was struggling with at the time. It was causing problems in the community of faith with this mixture of Gentiles. Gentiles were considered to be basically unclean, okay? Well, we just had that one story just before here, which this is kind of in contrast to that. In that earlier story, that 10 through 20, we saw Jesus, saying that with regard to the Torah, we don't need that anymore. And then we see opposite a way of being with Jesus in this scene. Pay attention. Stay tuned. Yeah. How did Jesus respond? Look at this. But he did not answer. Yeah, very. How do you interpret this? Certainly not as like, oh, as with love coming, just pouring out and little hearts flittering through on the Twitter screen. No, not at all. But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." They're like, we don't know what to think of is going on in the mind of Jesus, but it's clear that what the disciples are thinking is, we need to just get rid of this annoyance. He answered, and this is a statement that rings like you got to really deal with this. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's very possible that what Jesus is saying here is a reflection of one way of understanding the ministry of Jesus by Matthew's community, okay? The idea that, because this was a big question in early Christianity, was how Jewish is the church going to be? Do you need to be Jewish first to be Christian, or is it okay for you to just slide on in as an unclean person without going through the Judaistic tract? Okay, well, this statement of Jesus seems to reflect that attitude that Jesus is definitely this is trying to really give the people of the Moses tradition a boost, right? But we got to keep in mind, this is the same Jesus who, in a post-resurrection thing in Matthew 28, it will say, go ye therefore into all the world and all nations, right? So we know where the gospel is going. We know where Jesus' headspace is. Yet there is an element of holding back that was evident in the early church, and Matthew communicates that by preserving this statement of Jesus. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. Now, she's very insistent, right? He answered, and again, this is another, so first he is silent, secondly he says that thing, and now he says this. He answered, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. A very rude kind of a statement. Some commentators like to, Jesus couldn't have said something this mean and this cruel and this racist, right? This is, I believe, what we see in this scene, a counter to what we saw in that scene earlier in 10 to 20 about it, like throwing wide open, like, oh, no, nothing, no food is unclean and stuff like that. And this, we see the other side. So what we're seeing here are two sides of that debate within the early church, and we see them both acted out by Jesus and who he was. And she said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. So she's basically saying, okay, I'll take that. Yeah, I'll take that. This is, I believe, a scene whereby we see the movement, a way to try to break down the hardliners. There were hardliners in that day in the church that were saying, no, we must minister only to Israel, and we don't have any. Well, this is chipping away at that, in that Jesus is expressing the ideas of that way of thinking. And he, in the end, look at this. Then Jesus answered her, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed instantly. Yeah, I believe that what's happening here is a microcosm of what happens in the early church, where it goes from this hardline stance of like, can't even be it with it. When Jesus' first response was he said nothing, and then he said, and they stated the party line, which is, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And then with the degrading way of thinking of those who aren't Israel, right, calling them dogs. But in the end, relenting. I believe that what Jesus is doing is, Matthew, the way he's picturing Jesus, he's encapsulating that movement of thought in the early church, and the way it went from hardline, a way of thinking, to soft, and it eventually becomes inclusive. I believe that is what is demonstrated here. I don't know of how to ever say that in a sermon. I don't know. I do have to preach on this, so we'll see what we come up with, okay? Anyway, that's it for Power Bible Study today. I hope that you start to see how blessed we are in that we have been given a kind of grace and love that God has expressed to us through Jesus, and through the people that he has called his own, that we're not perfect. We never will be perfect. We're not going to be little angels walking around on earth. We're always going to be people in process, and therefore we're not always going to see the best of ourselves. We're not always going to see the best of each other all the time. That's probably just the way that's gonna always be. But it doesn't mean that God isn't at work. It doesn't mean that God's master plan, if you will, isn't being fulfilled. All of that points to the grace and love of God, God giving us room to make our mistakes. But yet, in the end, it's all about loving and loving all. Until next time, peace.